I never expected a day meant for joy to turn into a battlefield. The morning sun streamed through the enormous windows of the hotel ballroom, golden light bouncing off the crystal chandeliers, but nothing about that day felt warm. As I stood there in my simple, carefully chosen dress, I could feel the weight of their gazes. My fiancé's family, the people who were supposed to welcome me, were instead sizing me up like I was a mistake, a flaw in their picture-perfect world. I felt their whispers before I even heard them. The way the women clutched their designer handbags a little tighter, the subtle sneers, the curling of lips at my modest shoes, it was all too clear. They had always looked down on me, but I had never imagined the day would arrive when it would be in full display, under the sparkling chandeliers, in front of everyone I loved. I reminded myself to breathe, to hold my head high. I had fought too hard to be here. Every scholarship, every job, every sacrifice had led me to this point. And yet, here I was, a poor girl in their eyes, standing on the threshold of humiliation. Their words, though soft, were daggers. How could he marry someone so ordinary? Doesn't he know what he's getting into? I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to cry, to scream, to leave. But deep inside, a different feeling was stirring. One I didn't quite recognize at first. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was fire. I would not let them have this victory. Not today. Little did they know, everything was about to change. They had judged me for the life I had, the bank account I had, the clothes I wore. But they hadn't seen the quiet empire I had built behind the scenes, the contracts signed, the businesses acquired, the investments no one knew about. The girl they mocked had been preparing for this moment all along. And they would soon learn that power doesn't always announce itself with gold chains and luxury cars. Sometimes it arrives quietly, invisibly, until it smashes everything in its path. By the time the orchestra began to play and the guests rose to their feet, I had made my decision. I would walk down that aisle, smile at the man I loved, and let them watch as their carefully constructed world cracked at the seams. This wasn't just my wedding day. This was the day I would reclaim every ounce of respect they thought they had stolen from me. And as I took my first step forward, I could feel it, like the calm before a storm, the silence before a hurricane. The world was about to witness a reckoning, and I would be the one writing the rules. As I walked down the aisle, the polished marble floors reflected the shimmer of my dress, but all I could feel were the eyes, piercing, judgmental, full of disdain. My fiancé held my hand tightly, whispering encouragements I barely heard. His touch was warm, reassuring, but it did nothing to shield me from the storm around me. The whispers grew louder as I approached the front. Is that really her? I can't believe he settled for someone like that. Does he even know what he's doing? The women in the family exchanged subtle smirks, the kind that cut deeper than any words. They had planned this moment, the subtle orchestrated humiliation, the silent showing of superiority. I could almost see the lines they had drawn, the invisible boundary I was never meant to cross. But I didn't stumble. I didn't falter. Inside, a voice murmured, "They don't know you, not yet. They don't know what you're capable of." The ceremony progressed, but my mind was elsewhere, quietly observing, cataloging. Every glance, every scoff, every judgmental smile, it was all stored. They thought this was a display of weakness, that I would crumble under their scrutiny. They had no idea that I had built my life meticulously, piece by piece, in the shadows where no one could see. When the reception began, the tension reached its peak. The family gathered around the tables, still exuding the air of unshakable wealth and entitlement. They whispered behind their hands, glanced at me with thinly veiled disgust. I felt their words pierce through me like icy needles. She doesn't belong here. How did he even agree to this? It was then that I noticed the invitations. On each table, the guest list had been subtly altered to include people I barely knew, meant to isolate me from those who truly mattered, friends, colleagues, mentors. It was a small, cruel maneuver, but it revealed everything. They wanted me to feel powerless, to remind me of the life I didn't belong to. But here's the thing they didn't realize. I had anticipated this. Every snide remark, every calculated humiliation, every subtle attempt to diminish me, I had seen it coming. And now, watching them sip champagne and gossip, I felt the first surge of satisfaction. Because by the end of the night, everything they held dear would be in my hands. The first toast was announced. My fiancé stood beside me, smiling nervously as the family raised the IR glasses. The patriarch, his voice dripping with false warmth, made a speech about love, family, and tradition. Every word was a thinly veiled jab at me, at the poor girl who had dared enter their world. And in that moment, I decided that tonight wouldn't just be about love. It would be about revelation. Every secret I had kept, every silent victory, every quiet empire I had built in the shadows, they were about to see it all. They had mocked me for my lack of wealth, for my modest upbringing, for the shoes I wore and the dress I could afford. They thought this was their world, untouchable, untarnished by someone like me. But as I lifted my glass for the toast, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. The night had only just begun. By the time dinner was served, I felt the air around me thick with judgment. Every bite I took seemed to draw eyes sharper than knives. The laughter of the family echoed like a cruel symphony, each note a reminder that I was the outsider, the anomaly in their flawless picture. I watched them carefully, noting the subtle hierarchies, the unspoken alliances. The mother, draped in her designer gown, seemed determined to assert dominance through thinly veiled criticism. The sisters exchanged knowing glances whenever I moved, as though silently plotting some next humiliation. And the patriarch, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing, spoke only in polite sarcasm, each sentence a calculated barb. Yet I remained calm. Every insult, every smirk, every whispered comment fed the fire inside me. They had underestimated me from the very beginning, and that mistake would cost them dearly. It wasn't just the wedding day they had tried to control. It was their pride, their image, their illusion of superiority. And as I quietly sipped my water, I realized that tonight, all of it would be stripped away. After the main course, the music shifted to a soft melody. Couples swayed gently on the floor, and I felt a momentary pang of envy for their effortless grace. But I quickly dismissed it. I had no need for their approval. I had something far more potent: patience, precision, and planning. When the family began to gossip again, this time about my dress, my modest jewelry, and even my humble background, I let the words slide over me. Each insult was a brick in the wall I was building. Not around me but around them, to trap them in the revelation that was coming. I excused myself and walked to the balcony overlooking the city lights. The night was cold but exhilarating. The chaos inside the ballroom contrasted with the stillness of the streets below. I thought about the months of work, the silent investments, the businesses I had acquired without fanfare, the contracts signed in the shadows. They had mocked me for the life I had, not realizing that I had been building a world they could never imagine. Returning to the hall, I noticed the subtle tension had shifted. The family members were already sensing something, a quiet difference in me that they couldn't place. My calm composure, my subtle smiles, they were unnerving them, though they couldn't understand why. The first spark of confrontation came when the youngest sister leaned over to whisper something cruel about my parents' modest home. The words were meant to sting, but I felt nothing but clarity. Everything I had suffered, every humiliation had led to this moment. I realized then that revenge doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it is a quiet, devastating revelation that changes everything. As the night wore on, my plan began to crystallize. I would not confront them with rage or anger. That would be predictable, and they would dismiss me as emotional, weak. Instead, I would show them power, the kind they could not comprehend, the kind that cannot be ignored or belittled. By the time the cake was brought out, the murmurs and snickers had intensified. I could feel the tension in the room like a live wire. And I knew, tonight every insult, every mockery, every single moment of condescension would be repaid. Not with words but with reality. The celebration continued, but the air had shifted. I was no longer the poor girl they had assumed I was. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the first rush of satisfaction, a dark thrill at the impending revelation. They had mocked me publicly, and they would soon learn that humiliation can be returned in the most unexpected ways. As I stood beside my fiancé, raising a toast to family and love, I allowed a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. Inside, the gears of my plan had begun to turn. Every movement I made, every glance I gave was calculated. Every family member who thought they were in control had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. The ballroom was alive with laughter and chatter, but beneath it all a storm was gathering, one that no one could see yet. I moved with grace, careful not to draw attention to myself. But every step I took seemed to tighten the invisible tension around the family. They had assumed the night was theirs, that I would crumble under the weight of their scorn. How wrong they were. It began subtly. A friend of mine, invited under my insistence, approached me with a knowing look and whispered a single word that made my heart race. Ready. That one word was all it took. I had been waiting for this moment, the culmination of months of planning, quiet investments, and hidden power. I was about to shatter the perfect world they had built around themselves. The first revelation came when the patriarch, confident and smug, raised his glass for another toast. He began to speak about tradition, loyalty, and wealth, the pillars of their supposedly untouchable family empire. Every word was meant to intimidate, to assert superiority. But as he spoke, my friend discreetly handed me a tablet. On it were documents, contracts, and evidence that would make even the most seasoned skeptic gasp. I glanced down, feeling a thrill. This wasn't revenge through anger. It was calculated, precise, and irreversible. Every humiliation they had inflicted on me, every sneer, every whispered insult, they had unwittingly built the foundation for their own downfall. When the cake-cutting ceremony began, I casually turned the tablet on, connecting it to the big screen in the center of the hall. The room fell silent as the first image appeared. A legal notice confirming my acquisition of several businesses that the family had stakes in, without their knowledge. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Eyes widened. Whispers turned into murmurs of disbelief. The mother's face went pale, the sisters froze mid-laughter, and even my fiancé looked shocked, though I could see the pride in his eyes. They had laughed at me for being poor, for coming from a modest background. Yet here I was standing among them, with proof that I had quietly become a force they could not touch, a world they had ignored. I let the screen scroll slowly, showing one revelation after another. Properties acquired, contracts signed, investments made. The family's empire, which they had assumed was untouchable, was now intertwined with my own, legally and irrevocably. Every sneer, every whispered mockery, now felt like it had been a seed of their own ruin. The tension in the room was electric. No one knew how to respond. The laughter that had once dominated the space was replaced by stunned silence. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, insulted me, and now the reality of my power hung in the air, undeniable and suffocating. I raised my glass, smiled softly, and whispered, not to anyone in particular but to myself, "You never saw this coming." The first cracks in their carefully curated facade were showing. I didn't need to say anything more. The documents, the proofs, the undeniable power I wielded silently, these spoke louder than any words ever could. And as the night continued, I could see the subtle panic setting in. The family, once so confident, now whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward me, trying to grasp how a poor girl had accomplished the impossible. This was only the beginning. The dark twist I had planned for them was far from over. The humiliation they had inflicted on me would be repaid in ways they could not imagine, ways that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about control, power, and respect. By the time the music played again, the atmosphere had shifted completely. I had not spoken a word to shame them. I had merely revealed the truth. And in that truth they found their fear, their shock, and the realization that the world they had mocked me for was slipping through their fingers. By the time the evening had reached its peak, the air in the ballroom was thick with disbelief. Conversations had dwindled to nervous murmurs, and every pair of eyes seemed glued to me. I moved with quiet confidence, smiling faintly, the kind of smile that promised calm on the surface but concealed a storm beneath. The patriarch, once the unshakable center of authority, now looked uncertain, flipping through the documents that my friend discreetly distributed among key family members. Their reality was unraveling before them, and each revelation was like a strike against the walls of their pride. I walked among the tables, subtly observing the reactions. The mother's lips were pressed in a tight line, her face drained of color, as if the walls of her carefully built superiority were crumbling inward. The sisters avoided my gaze entirely, some hiding behind drinks, others feigning interest in the table settings. Their silent fear was intoxicating, and I let myself savor it, just a little. Every insult they had thrown at me, every sneer and whisper, had been catalogued in my mind, and now in the quiet devastation of their world, I let it ripple through the room. The poor girl they had mocked had become an invisible hurricane. Then came the subtle escalation. I made a casual remark about the family's business holdings, mentioning one of the companies they were heavily invested in, and the reaction was immediate. Panic flashed across the patriarch's face. He muttered under his breath, but I caught it. How did she know? The realization hit them all at once. I wasn't just wealthy. I was entwined in their empire, connected in ways they had ignored, underestimated, and ridiculed. Their world, which had always seemed untouchable, was suddenly fragile, vulnerable, and exposed. I didn't need to shout or accuse. The documents and my calm composure did the work for me. Every whisper, every judging glance they had cast on me came back like a boomerang. Their pride, the very shield they had wielded against me for years, was now their weaponless vulnerability. The most satisfying moment came when one of the sisters, trying to salvage dignity, attempted a sarcastic comment about my modest beginnings. I simply smiled, lifted my glass, and nodded. No words. The silence that followed spoke louder than any reply I could have given. Their mockery had no power here. As the night progressed, it became evident that this was no longer about me marrying into the family. This was about the balance of power, and I held the scale. Every detail I had quietly controlled, the investments, the contracts, the strategic alliances, was now visible, undeniable, and irreversible. I caught my fiancé's hand in mine, and for a moment the world narrowed to just us. His eyes reflected pride and astonishment, but more importantly, trust. He had believed in me from the beginning, even when they hadn't. That trust fortified me, and I realized something essential. This night wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving that I belonged on every level, in a world that had tried to exclude me. By the time the evening drew toward its final dances, the family had grown restless. Their smiles were forced, their laughter hollow, and every glance at me carried an unspoken acknowledgement of defeat. They had treated me as a nobody, but now, in their own home among their own people, they understood that I had become the force they had never expected. The night ended with applause and toasts, but the echoes of fear, shock, and begrudging respect lingered. And deep inside, I knew the final act, the dark twist, was still to come. Their world had been shaken, but the true reckoning was yet to arrive. Perfect. Now we move into part 6. The dark twist begins to hit full force. The family faces the devastating reality, and the protagonist's revenge becomes unavoidable. The next morning, the aftermath of the previous night's revelations lingered like a heavy fog. The family woke to the reality that nothing was as they had believed. Their whispers behind closed doors, their hurried phone calls, their anxious glances, they all betrayed the fear that had taken root. I stayed quiet, observing from a distance, letting the tension build. There was no need to speak. Each passing hour amplified the weight of their defeat. Their arrogance, their condescension had blinded them, and now that blindness would cost them everything. The first cracks in their personal lives began to show almost immediately. Investments that had seemed untouchable were now legally entangled with mine. Properties they had boasted about were now inaccessible without my approval. Every small advantage they had flaunted over me, their wealth, their social influence, their assumed superiority, was quietly slipping away. They called lawyers, advisors, friends, all trying desperately to understand how I had infiltrated their world so thoroughly, so invisibly. Each explanation they received only deepened their panic. It wasn't luck, it wasn't chance, it was strategy, careful, meticulous, relentless. By mid-afternoon, the sisters had attempted to corner me, hoping perhaps to shame me publicly, to reclaim some semblance of control. They underestimated me yet again. I met their aggression with calmness, with a smile that masked the storm inside. Each attempt to intimidate me bounced back like a rubber ball. Ineffective, futile. The patriarch, now visibly shaken, tried to assert dominance through authority, but the documents, the investments, the contracts, they rendered him powerless. His voice, once commanding, now trembled with uncertainty. He realized, perhaps too late, that the world he had built on pride and privilege was vulnerable to someone he had deemed inferior. And then it happened. The mother, in a final attempt to maintain dignity, confronted me directly. She demanded answers, tried to belittle me with words meant to cut, but the truth had a weight far heavier than any insult she could muster. I revealed quietly, methodically, the full extent of my holdings, the businesses, the connection. and the power I had amassed. The room fell silent. Every accusation, every whispered insult they had ever made now hovered over their heads like a dark cloud. They had believed they could define me by my background, by my upbringing, by the clothes I wore and the modesty of my life. But power, true power, is not measured by appearances. It is measured by control, by strategy, by the ability to reshape the world in your image. I left them there, stunned and defeated. I did not gloat, I did not mock. My victory was quiet, precise, absolute. And as I walked away, the dark twist became clear. The people who had tried to diminish me, who had treated me like an inferior being, were now fully aware that their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. From that moment, their lives would never be the same. Every whispered judgment, every cruel smile, every thoughtless remark, they had all contributed to their own downfall. And I, the girl they had scorned, stood quietly triumphant, the architect of their humiliation, the invisible force they could neither escape nor confront. The darkness of the twist was not in what I said or did. It was in what I allowed them to realize. That they had underestimated someone they believed powerless, and that mistake would haunt them forever. Perfect. Now we move into part 7. The fallout intensifies, relationships collapse, and the protagonist's dominance becomes undeniable. Days passed, but the echo of the previous night's revelations lingered like a shadow over the family. The ballroom, once a place of celebration and pride, was now etched in their minds as the night their certainty was shattered. Every glance they exchanged carried the unspoken acknowledgement. The poor girl they had mocked had rewritten the rules. Their interactions became cautious, almost fearful. The patriarch, whose word had once been law, now consulted me quietly, hesitating as if asking permission without daring to voice it. The mother, who had prided herself on controlling appearances, now measured her words before speaking, careful not to provoke the wrong response. The sisters, once haughty and scornful, kept their distance, their laughter hollow, their smiles forced. I observed it all with a cold satisfaction, aware that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. They had treated me as insignificant, but now every move they made depended on me, whether they admitted it or not. The wedding day had been a revelation, but the days following were the slow, inevitable dismantling of their arrogance. Every subtle attempt they made to regain control failed. Invitations were declined, suggestions ignored, opinions overlooked. They realized, too late, that their influence no longer extended to the one person they had underestimated most. And the realization was painful, bitter, and humiliating. A fitting punishment for years of condescension and scorn. Even my fiancé, who had supported me quietly throughout, began to see the depth of the shift. He had loved me for who I was, but now he could witness firsthand the transformation of perception around us. The family's disbelief, their scrambling, their sudden desperate politeness, it was a revelation of how fragile their power truly was. And yet, the darkness of the twist was not in mere power. It was in control, the quiet, invisible domination that left them aware, constantly aware, of their own vulnerability. I never needed to speak harsh words, never needed to attack directly. The knowledge of my influence, my reach, my silent victories, suffocated them more than any insult could. One afternoon, the mother attempted a confrontation, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound composed. She demanded explanations, sought to understand how I had come to possess such influence, and how I had quietly interwoven myself into the very fabric of their empire. I answered calmly, carefully, revealing only as much as necessary. Each detail I shared was precise, cutting, and inescapable. By the end of our conversation, she was pale, silent, and defeated. I had not yelled, I had not raged. I had simply shown the reality she refused to see. The family's empire, which they had believed untouchable, now rested partly in my hands, legally and irrevocably. Every act of condescension they had thrown at me had only accelerated their own fall. And in that moment, the dark twist became undeniable. They were no longer the arbiters of respect, pride, and power in this world. That authority had quietly, completely shifted. I was no longer the poor girl they had scorned. I was the invisible force that dictated the course of their lives. The subtle, relentless control I wielded was far more devastating than any act of vengeance. It was constant, unyielding, and inescapable. And as I watched them navigate this new reality, I felt a dark satisfaction deeper than any fleeting triumph. It was a recognition that power, when underestimated, is the ultimate weapon. Perfect. Now we reach part 8, the final dark twist, ultimate humiliation for the family, and the protagonist's quiet, complete victory. Weeks passed, and the family's world had subtly but irreversibly shifted. The grandeur they once flaunted, the confidence they carried so easily, it had all been replaced by unease, second-guessing, and quiet panic. They moved like people trapped in a storm, uncertain where the next gust would hit, and for the first time, they understood the true weight of underestimating someone. I observed it all calmly, almost detached, though inside a deep satisfaction simmered. The dark twist was complete. Not through shouting, not through anger, but through reality itself. I had become the silent authority they could neither ignore nor challenge. Every conversation, every decision they now made, was shadowed by the knowledge that I had control. The final blow came unexpectedly. The patriarch, in an attempt to reclaim dignity, called a family meeting, confident that he could reassert himself. He spoke at length, trying to outline the family's priorities, the empire they had built, the legacy they intended to protect. His voice, once commanding and fearless, now trembled under the weight of uncertainty. I stood quietly listening, allowing him to finish. And then, with deliberate calm, I revealed the last piece of the puzzle. A series of legal documents signed, notarized, and public, showing that I now held majority control in several of their key ventures. Their empire was no longer untouchable. It was intertwined with mine, fully dependent on my consent. The room went silent. The mother's face drained of color. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but could not form words. The sister's eyes widened, their haughty arrogance evaporating into panic. The patriarch slumped into his chair, his authority crumbling before him. For years, they had mocked me for being poor, ordinary, insignificant. And now the reality was undeniable. I was the force that had redefined their world. No one spoke. The silence was louder than any accusation, any insult, any plea for mercy. The dark twist was complete. The family had been so consumed by pride, so blinded by arrogance, that they never saw me coming. They had treated me as beneath them, unaware that I had built a foundation they could never challenge, a quiet empire that now held them in its grip. And in that silence I felt the final satisfaction, not revenge through cruelty but through truth. Their humiliation was not public mockery, nor dramatic confrontation. It was reality itself, a force that could not be denied. They had underestimated me, scorned me, and now they were forced to live in the world I had created. A world where they no longer held the power they had assumed was theirs by birthright. I smiled faintly, a dark, quiet satisfaction settling in my chest. The girl they had called poor had not only entered their world, she had quietly reshaped it. And the realization, slow and suffocating, would haunt them forever. As I left the meeting, the room frozen in disbelief behind me, I understood the ultimate truth of the night, of the wedding, of the months of planning and silent work. Power is not always visible, respect is not always demanded, and underestimating someone is the quickest path to destruction. They had called me a beggar, mocked my modest beginnings, and whispered their disdain. And now their empire, their pride, and their carefully curated world were no longer theirs. The dark twist was complete, and in its quiet, unrelenting weight, I finally allowed myself to breathe.